Africa has a booming population and rich natural resources. Today's guest, James Mwangi, says it's also primed to take the lead in the global shift toward a sustainable future. You might know him as the co-founder of Dahlberg, a social impact investment group that started identifying moral ways to make money well over 2 decades ago, long before it was trendy. More recently, he's become an advocate for the Great Carbon Valley, an ambitious project working to make Kenya the Iceland of the South for carbon removals, and not just the tree planting kind. By the way, don't worry, nature-based climate solutions are still our passion, and we're still leery of the tech bros peddling what we all know is bunk on the carbon capture side. But we also know we need direct air capture done right, and today we'll hear why Kenya can and should lead on that. James doesn't see Africa as some bystander in the climate fight. He sees it as a powerhouse for innovation and leadership. While some worry about Africa's growing population as a ticking time bomb, he sees a demographic dividend. In today's conversation, we're diving into some of the big contradictions we love exploring at carbonparadox.org, paradoxes that reflect the challenges of tackling wicked problems, but are often presented as products of carbon markets rather than what they are. Namely, challenges to implementing them, like the control paradox. Who's really calling the shots in carbon markets? James argues Africa has the potential to lead, not just follow, the additionality paradox. Should carbon finance be about kickstarting solutions or only funding things that need carbon finance to even exist? James says it should be a catalyst, not a barrier. And the community's paradox. Why do we keep pretending that indigenous and forest communities, whether in Kenya, Brazil, or Indonesia, are monolithic entities different from other communities around the world? To these, James adds 2 of his own paradoxes, or illusions as he calls them. The power illusion is the idea that blocking carbon removals will somehow force fossil fuel companies to stop emitting. Spoiler, it won't. The mastery illusion is the myth that all the real expertise lies elsewhere, when in reality, Africa's got the talent, knowledge, and drive to lead this transition. This is a conversation about flipping the script from colonial preconceptions to modern reality, where Africa is at the center of the climate story. Yes, as a victim, but more as a leader. This episode is also brought to you by you, assuming you're a patron at patreon.com. There you can support us for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. The exact address is patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. And Bionic Planet is all one word, no dots or dashes. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. We'd also like to thank Quantum Commodity Intelligence for making this episode and all of our current Africa coverage possible. These guys are at the forefront of democratizing investment in Africa, and you can find them at qcintel.com. Also all one word. That's qcintel.com. Let's get into it.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Okay, so I'm sitting here with James Mwangi in this beautiful part of Nairobi called Karen, where we've already been visited by a rooster. So you might hear a rooster, you might get some wind, you might get some funny background noise, like an airplane flying overhead. But let me just dive right in. I know James is we don't have a whole lot of time today, so James, I'm just going to ask you to first just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're from Kenya, but you spent a lot of time in the States, and then you came back, and now you're doing a lot of stuff that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. So great to be here, Steve. As you said, I was born here in Nairobi, grew up here, left to go do my college education in the U.S., started a career in management consulting in New York after I graduated college, and left the firm I was at to co-found what became a firm called Dahlberg. which eventually grew into one of the world's largest social impact advisory businesses with something like 700 people in 32 locations. By 2010, I moved to Johannesburg to start our Africa presence, and was then serving as managing partner for a number of years, and basically led what became the Dahlberg Group for a while. To the extent that I kept my hand in management consulting, I was really focused on the critical question of how do you create enough jobs in Africa to turn our surging population into a youth dividend rather than a demographic time bomb. And back in 2019, I began to become increasingly concerned that we weren't necessarily on track, and that unless we had a new way of defining African competitiveness, the continent wouldn't attract the kind of investment it would need and wouldn't create the kind of jobs that would be needed to absorb hundreds of millions of young people over the remaining part of the century. And that led me to think about climate and climate action. So lots of people talk about climate change and its impacts in Africa, which are real and devastating, and the need for some degree of climate justice to make up for that. Sometimes that very true and fair argument obscures another reality, which is Africa, because of its endowments of renewable energy, natural resources, and that demographic dividend, is uniquely positioned to scale up many of the technologies that we will need and many of the approaches that we will need to first bring the climate crisis under control and hopefully engage in climate repair in due course. So that became a new passion project. I left my consulting and professional services business and launched the Climate Action Platform Africa, which is a nonprofit systems orchestrator and think tank that's basically pushing this idea of climate positive growth. And then I also, 2.5 years ago, launched Africa Climate Ventures with 2 other co-founders. And there we are working to invest in companies that we believe have the potential to be globally competitive in some aspect of addressing and speaking to the climate crisis.
Maybe before we move on, you can just talk a little bit about those 2 enterprises, flesh them out a little bit.
Yeah, so Climate Action Platform Africa, CAPA, was where it all started. It actually is, if you look at where most of the people in there began their journey into climate, a lot of them were part of a small team I put together to basically say, let's figure out where jobs might be in this century for Africa. And that went from an internal consulting project to a passion initiative to eventually just like we need to build this into an institution. And what CAPA does, ably led by a team that includes my co-founder of CAPA, Carlene Nowen, what they're doing is they're identifying, quantifying, helping prioritize, and helping realize specific opportunities for what we call climate positive growth. So what are these big growth opportunities that actually benefit the planet's kind of greenhouse gas balance, whether it's through removals, avoided emissions, name it, and really push that. So that's what CAPA does. It's churned out a lot of data, has worked in the background quite quietly and involved in things such as the Africa Climate Summit and the Nairobi Declaration, which has the phrase climate positive growth in there as something African countries have really committed to pursuing and exploring. And then also it works with other nonprofits and other system players, including businesses, to say, well, how do we go after some of these opportunities and make them addressable? Conversely, ACV, Africa Climate Ventures, is a commercial venture builder. We raised a little bit of capital from founders, friends, family. Some people would say some fools also came along. And they backed us to basically go out there and prove the concept by backing or helping build 3 or 4 enterprises over the last 2.5 years, which we went out and did. And then we've been raising additional rounds of capital, core capital, because this is not a fund in the traditional sense. It's a business that builds other businesses or accelerates other businesses. And today, ACV is holding a portfolio I would say is pretty exciting from a climate perspective, right? We are partnering with Cocoa Networks, one of the most exciting businesses tapping into promising aspects of the carbon credit market and showing how you can translate that into real delivered benefit through bioethanol clean cooking. Great Carbon Valley is our green industrial park developer, which is partnering with big names around the world, like Climeworks in the US, Tencent in China, to really unlock East Africa's particular advantage because of our combination of geothermal resources and other renewable energy to be a major hub for everything from direct air capture to other forms of green industry. And then with Safi, we're doing, organic fertilizer at scale, with Safi Organics, actually delivering a product that's outcompeting synthetic fertilizer in the field today and tapping a carbon removal subsidy to do that. And we're looking at doing enhanced rock weathering in South Africa. So lots of terms to throw around, but it gives a sense of A, we're really looking across Africa for areas of competitiveness, and B, we try to look in areas that people weren't automatically thinking Africa would be a world leader in.
And that, I think, is what really drew me to you, because I've done a lot of coverage from here, almost all on nature-based solutions, which is really my passion. But you're actively involved in things that, as you point out, we don't associate with Africa, such as the Great Carbon Valley. I want to get to that. And even on the nature-based front, you're doing biochar. You mentioned Safi. And that's also, I haven't written about biochar or covered it in about 8 years. And so I'd like to dive into that. Before we do that, though, there's one thing I want to make sure we touch on before I forget. And it's something we talked about over lunch a few weeks ago, which is the three illusions you brought up, on the three illusions that are kind of hindering the advancement of carbon finance. Do you remember?
Yeah, and I'll try and recall them with a reasonable degree of fidelity if I can. And I think there's a lot of things that are going to be difficult about unlocking carbon finance and climate funding to actually do the things we need to do at the scale we need to do them. Lots of things are just genuinely hard. In addition, there's spaces where I do think that the climate action movement and civil society and well-intentioned people are in some ways tying ourselves up in knots that are unhelpful. So, for example, when folks say, well, carbon markets are about exporting a problem that was created in the global north to the global south, or any carbon transaction must be about exploitation because so little money is reaching the end beneficiaries. There's an aspect there of, yes, there's issues to solve, and I'll come back to some of the dynamics of the illusions themselves. There's issues that need to be solved in all of this. But at the same time, we don't solve them by saying, don't touch these things. We solve them by actually understanding what are the levers and going deep in. Because if you look at what the outcome of Baku was, the world agreed that the developing world needs trillions of dollars of climate finance per year, but governments were only willing to commit to maybe 300 billion a year. And that number's probably falling with every day today. So the gap between the trillions and the 300 billion has to be innovative market solutions. There's no other way. And it's time for us to really dive into that. And I think we need to, in doing that, we need to overcome a few illusions. The first one is, I think, an illusion of control or power. So one of the arguments I hear very often is, we should not explore or scale up things like carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. Anything other than nature, we should leave out. And there's a number of reasons. One is it's too expensive and too inefficient, and we should do other things. And we can come back to that argument. But there's another argument I hear that I struggle with, which is it'll give the fossil fuel companies permission to emit.
Speaking of emissions.
Now, I struggle with that because we know from all of the reports, all of the science, we are going to need massive amounts of removals. And the longer we are delaying the big cuts in emissions, the more removals we're going to need in order to avert first the worst outcomes and hopefully eventually get to fixing the climate in some way, shape, or form. And yes, a lot of these things are expensive. They don't get cheap by magic. They get cheap by people doing them again and again and again. The same way that I think Jimmy Carter paid $70,000 for a solar panel to put on the roof of the White House in the late 70s. It didn't get to where it is now by people saying, well, that's too expensive, leave it alone. It got there by repeated action. But the piece I'll really dig into is this idea that we're giving a license to interests that want to preserve fossil fuels. And the challenge there is, do we really believe that the part of society that is really convinced that climate change is the biggest challenge facing humanity, has enough power to actually win the political argument against the fossil fuel industry. I don't think the fossil fuel industry it's a risk down the road, but right now they're just emitting regardless, and us tying ourselves in knots on things we need to do because it might give them an additional excuse, they have all the excuses they need already. So let's not pretend that we can control that behavior except through advocating directly for reductions in fossil fuels. Let's do that. And let's also be realistic about the fact that we need to scale up a whole bunch of other things, which also happen to be big job creating and economic opportunities for the global south, if we can dive into them in the right way and actually mobilize those young people to not be a passive passenger in the global economy, but actually be the workforce that is focused on achieving a sustainable climate for the planet.
Yeah. And I think the way you phrased it last time was that the illusion is that we have the power to just turn a switch and shut this whole thing down, and it just can't be done.
It's just not true. I mean, look at what's happened. Even relatively modest attempts to engage this spaces, you're seeing a lot of pushback, and I think we have a much longer fight to win the median member of the public on the end of fossil fuels, probably by showing them real good alternatives. And that is separate from the equally important work of building all of the other levers we're going to need in order to survive the 21st century and make it into the 22nd century.
Yep. And another illusion that you mentioned that was really relevant to today's conversation, I think you called it the mastery illusion. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where this illusion of mastery or projected mastery, right? So what you'll often hear from certain kinds of campaigners is, surely someone somewhere, this must be a scam. Someone somewhere knows exactly what they're doing, and here they're talking about carbon markets in particular, knows exactly what they're doing and are extracting massive amounts of money to benefit themselves at the expense of African communities, African land, etc., etc. And it ignores the fact that the whole idea of creating some sort of synthetic instrument like a carbon credit is relatively new. The first generation of experimental projects are working their way through. And whether it's in the technical approaches to either avoiding emissions or removing emissions, or in how to structure the transactions or how to manage the projects, everyone is just learning. And my worry is when people say, well, people out there in the world are doing these things to and for Africa, and that's not good. Yes, I agree. What we need to recognize is this is one industry where the best in the world don't have that big a lead over smart young people in the continent, and we can catch up. The gap in mastery is not that big, and there's actually a chance to make this an industry that is entirely driven for and by and with local communities and local talent. But you don't get to that if you assume that, well, how in the hell could we ever understand, direct air carbon capture? It turns out that actually there's a lot of geochemists and geophysicists trained here in Kenya who understand some of these processes fine, and we're just looking for the opportunity. We just need to believe that talent is there, give it the shot, and actually pursue mastery instead of attributing it to some other mastermind out there.
Yeah, I think you said there were 10,000 unemployed accountants in Kenya.
If that, I mean, and that number is going to grow with AI. There's a lot of people who could be applying themselves to actually, this stuff is complex. Carbon accounting is complex, make no mistake, but it is not rocket science.
Right.
And actually you have exactly one of the resources Africa brings to the table is a lot of people who have the basic entry-level professional training to understand the space and do not have a competing use for that skill in the local market. So we should be racing to actually be the place that's actually innovating at the frontier of these transactions, figuring out how you capture the most value for local economies, and creating a full value chain. This is not about someone flying in from Zurich to develop a project in Dar es Salaam. This is about people from Tanzania going to Arusha or going to Moshi, looking at what they have there and actually developing something that they can export as a climate benefit to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and especially on the land use front, so much of it is just processes that need to go in place. And,
exactly.
And I call them the instant experts. I feel like you go to these conferences and you see someone who took a 2-week course and now they're sitting up there on a panel and they're blabbing about something that you can take any Kenyan farmer who can run rings around them. And and so I totally agree with that. It's I always complain about, nothing against Americans, I am one, but American kids all have these pitch decks. They're
Yeah.
great at pitch decks,
Yep.
but they can't do agroforestry.
Well,
There's
a
nothing
few of
wrong
them
with-
will be able to, and
Yeah,
the same
yeah.
thing. Like there will be spaces where the fastest path to real impact is going to be the American kids learning how to do agroforestry in Africa.
Yeah.
I suspect there's a much bigger category of situations where the local agroforestry expert learning those 2 or 3 things and learning how to pitch is the line of least resistance.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's easier to pitch than it is to produce. So,
Exactly.
I want to kind of dive into some of the nitty gritty stuff that we talked about too, because you mentioned it at the start, biochar, and its role in Kenya. Can you talk a little bit about biochar in general, and then we can shift to Safi and the more specific enterprises you're working on?
So, and here, Steve, I'll be the first one to say I am a perfect example of a newfound
Right. Okay.
mastery, and I don't even know I'm there yet. Why we got excited about biochar at Africa Climate Ventures is we were asking, what are the pathways to removing large amounts of carbon dioxide in this decade? And you look at it, and a lot of people are figuring out ways to, using chemical reactions or other things, remove CO2 from the atmosphere and sequester it, with DAC, with enhanced rock weathering, with ocean fertilization, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of work going on there. The most successful process for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere throughout the history of this planet has been photosynthesis. The challenge with photosynthesis is once the plant dies, it burns or rots, and you kind of go back. And I've always found biochar to be this really elegant step where, you pyrolyze the biomass that you want to convert. And, by heating it in the absence of oxygen, you avoid that process of burning. And you're left with quite a lot of carbon that would have otherwise turned into CO2. Now, this is not a new process, right? There's evidence that indigenous communities in South America were engaged in large-scale application of biochar 5,000 years ago. It accounts for some of the fertility of some of the soils there. So that's not new. I think what's been new is really asking, how do we scale it up? There was a bunch of people who jumped to, well, actually, if we just get the carbon credit price high enough, you can just make biochar and, give it away in some way. And when we looked at the economics, we said that actually probably doesn't work, because there's a lot of work that goes into gathering the biomass, tracking what you're doing with it, and so on and so forth. And it may look like all you're doing is shoving stuff in one end and earning carbon credits the other, but you actually need to think through a business that can sustain itself in some way, or can treat carbon as one of a range of revenue pathways. So we went out there and said, well, who's showing that they can do that? And in a stroke of real luck, we ran into a lot of really good folks who were thinking about different business plans for deploying capital assets to make biochar in Kenya, in Africa, and scale up. And then we came across this team, Safi Organics, who've been quietly operating in Mwea, which is just outside of Nairobi, about 90 minutes drive, depending on how fast you drive. My business partner, CJ, can probably do it in 60. Maybe, hopefully, the Kenyan traffic police aren't listening to this. But Mwea is the Kenyan rice belt. And these guys had been making biochar from rice husk for 7 years, making it into fertilizer by adding organic foliar ingredients, and actually selling it to the community at a price competitive with subsidized synthetic imported fertilizer. And in most cases, showing that they were delivering, according to scientific trials that have been held on this by Cornell University and others, they were delivering results equal, or in many cases better than, the synthetic alternative. So suddenly you're like, wait, before you add any carbon, this is an approach to taking biomass that is already available, converting it into something valuable using local labor and distributed technologies, deploying it into the farms to people who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be able to afford fertilizer at the rate that they needed to boost their yields. And, you're displacing exports. You're displacing the 3 or 4 tons of emissions that come with every ton of synthetic fertilizer today. Oh, and by the way, for every ton you put in the ground, you're putting about a ton as well, give or take a little bit, of CO2 permanently into the ground. It's, to my mind, almost the platonic ideal of a win-win-win.
Yeah.
Now, there are limits to growth. You need to find places where you're really dealing with waste biomass or biomass that wouldn't otherwise have had another useful use in managing the carbon balances. But we believe that starting with an enterprise that is already delivering value and figuring out how you accelerate it with revenue from carbon and climate finance is the way forward, versus kind of just parachuting in solutions. Now, sometimes you may have to do that, but this is what I love about the Safi Organic story.
Yeah, and it's a real example of transitional finance too, because that's one of those sticky issues. I don't know if you want to go into this, but the issue of additionality, I find the whole thing frustrating because people look at a project like this where there's more than one income stream.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, gee, they can make money other ways. Why do they need the carbon finance? But you need the carbon finance to put it over the top, and it's the kind of thing that once it gets going, the carbon finance can eventually go away, and it continues on its own.
Yeah.
And there are some critics who would say, well, no, you should just be doing capture and storage, because with capture and storage, it only exists to capture carbon and store it, so the additionality question isn't confusing. But this actually brings in it's catalytic.
Exactly. And in a way, what gives away the game is many of the same people who argue about, well, the lack of additionality, if there's another valuable use for this stream, whether it's the avoided emissions from clean cooking, well, there's consumers who are very happy with that product, and should have paid more for, or they're paying for it, and or fertilizer, you should have just let the market do its magic. Those very same people will then turn around and say, wait, but we can't really back some of these projects because they're so utterly dependent on carbon credits that they're not sustainable.
Exactly, yeah.
The way out is to say, actually, carbon has to be that additional revenue stream that tips things from being maybe barely viable or not quite viable to being really attractive destinations, because you're not attracting the millions, tens of millions of dollars you're going to need to scale up these solutions rapidly, unless you can say, oh, and here's a way to translate the public good that is coming, because there's a benefit to the farmer, and the farmer is paying what the market will bear. But that's not the only value that's being delivered. There's a massive value being delivered to each and every one of us from these farmers switching to this solution versus others. And it is in our interest to increase the economic signal that they should do so, because we want more of that positive externality. So we need to be more sophisticated about, hey, multiple value streams is almost a non-negotiable in many of these sectors. And what you're trying to then do is say, where is it that I'm getting the biggest carbon or greenhouse gas bang for my buck? Very rarely will it be in purely freestanding, this is entirely additional. Okay, fine, it's entirely additional. You got 100 tons. For the same amount of money, just nudging a few things over the line that were close to being over the line, you could have gotten, 1,000 tons, maybe 10,000 tons for the same money. We can't afford to tie ourselves in these theoretical knots. We need to actually start moving tons.
Yep. And now you've sold, how many credits have you sold from this project so far?
We've done a few thousand credits to date. And part of, interestingly, because when they started, they were working with Kontiki kilns and artisanal processes, they weren't able to credit this. And they couldn't justify the investment in more sophisticated machinery. And
that was because the emissions were, the emissions generated were higher, right? Is that the reason?
When you run an artisanal process, there's a lot of process emissions, and also just tracking the data is next to impossible. So they weren't crediting. There was a benefit, but it was hard to quantify, hard to track, and hard to compensate. And so they were muddling along, finding ways to bootstrap this business to the point where it was serving thousands, if not tens of thousands of farmers, purely based on doing well this year and in reinvesting the next year.
Right.
Opening the pathway to crediting carbon and linking that to the investment in a new factory, in new machinery, actually made a scale up of this. They already have the loyal farmer, they already have the IP around the formulas for the fertilizer. All they needed was a pathway to scale that would excite a banker or an investor. And that's what we think we found. And that's what the carbon is doing in that instance, is it's giving these entrepreneurs who've done everything we say people should do to respond to the climate crisis, it's giving them a shot at the same kind of scaling capital they would have gotten if they'd gone instead to work on a new dating app or yet another fintech app.
Right. Can you flesh that out a bit? I don't know how much you can say about pricing. Like, how many credits did you sell? What price was it? How did you develop this? What were your partners? Or if that's confidential, I understand.
It's not confidential necessarily. It's I hesitate because I don't want to start flipping through my notes, and I don't want to give you a wrong number.
Okay.
It was in the $120 a ton range for the biochar credits. It was through Puro. And it was to a global North technology buyer
Okay.
And there's a lot of demand coming in from other potential buyers as we now move from a business that was doing, several hundreds, maybe 1,000 tons a year, to one that will have the installed capacity this year to do many times that. And hopefully we'll continue to scale as we add other locations.
Okay. And I might follow up with you or your team afterwards, flesh that out for a piece for quantum commodity intelligence. And now moving on, because this is so we've talked about the biochar, and this is the other thing we've got to mention. I think you touched on it, but the feed for this is rice husks.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So
if you went to these locations, what you'd see in Mwea a few years ago is rice husks just being burnt to get rid of it because it was just piling up. A little bit of it was being used to run boilers and so on, but you had a lot of smog, a lot of local air pollution issues. And suddenly you move to high-tech pyrolyzers, and we'll need to take you up to one of the Safi Takaveta units made by Takacha, one of our technology partners. And you can see actually right above where the little machine is that does a ton a day, managed by this local youth group that's basically turned this into their local enterprise. They receive waste rice husk, they process it, and then they ship out sacks of biochar to go be turned into fertilizer. About, I want to say 6 feet above where the chimney of the pyrolyzer, you have the most dense collection of weaver bird nests I've ever seen, because they just love the warmth. They love so going from everyone coughing and tearing up to something that is actually attracting wildlife or bird life, I thought was just a pretty magical story. Again, adds another win to I think there are now 5 wins in this particular business model.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Yeah. Let's moving on to the next thing, because that is kind of in the realm of nature-based solutions. I'd say it's kind of tangential, but you're also talking about the Great Carbon Valley, and this is something I just never, I never thought of. I just don't associate carbon capture and storage with Africa because you have all these natural resources.
Yeah.
You've made a pretty interesting argument for direct air capture here in Kenya. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so, and some of your listeners will be sick of hearing me lay this out if they've ever come across me in any setting, but my apologies to them. You can skip forward a few minutes if you want to. But if you think about Kenya, and I'll focus narrowly on Kenya, but this is just as true of Ethiopia, for example, in the Rift Valley. If you look at a country like Kenya, we have our grid is about 3 gigawatts, so 3,000 megawatts of power. That's medium to large size non-industrial city in the U.S. for 55 million people. You're not industrializing much with that kind of power. It's almost entirely green. So between our geothermal resources, some hydro, some of the best wind energy in the world, and of course we're on the equator, so hey, we have some decent solar assets. Between all of those, we are, the available renewable energy is many hundreds of times the 3 gigawatts. And yet power on the grid is expensive, and we only have the 3 gigawatts on the grid. And often when you ask big industry, why aren't you coming to a country like Kenya, which has a relatively well-educated population, relatively liberal business policies, yes, some problems on the governance side, but not unusual for an emerging country. I know some people will be like, corruption. Yes, there's a problem, but actually not remarkable in the set of countries we'd be compared against. And oftentimes it boils down to, once you think about the cost of energy, it's too high. Why is the cost of energy too high? Because the marginal cost of an energy unit today is high because you're paying off lots of really inefficient or really old power. You're paying actually for power that's not being used, and so on and so forth. And so you end up in this circular problem. Industry isn't coming because the power is too expensive. New power is not being built because industry isn't coming. And so you're building out some of in the best locations in the world to build renewable energy. You're building out as slowly as you can imagine, about 100 to 150 megawatts of new power a year. That's not a technical limit. That's not a resource limit. That's purely because we don't know who would buy the rest of the power if we ran out ahead of it. Now, what industries like direct air carbon capture, novel industries like those do, is they allow you, because Kenya, by virtue of its geothermal resource, is also a really attractive place to mineralize carbon once you've captured it either from CCS or from DAC processes, it allows you to say, actually, yes, you're worried about Kenya in all of these different ways, but actually we can develop captive projects or partially captive projects to supply you with the energy and other resources that you need, that builds up a bigger and bigger energy system that somewhat perversely lowers the price of energy on the system, because you're getting the economies of scale and so on and so forth. And that then allows local entrepreneurs, local consumers to have access to power at a more affordable price.
Yeah.
In a sense, you need that big anchor buyer to say, yeah, I will take the first 50 megawatts of power out of this plant. Okay, now you can build it. You have 15 more megawatts. What do you do with that? Attract another industry, attract something else. You could use it to go to consumers. We think actually most African consumers are probably better off doing some combination of solar and storage for home use, and that you really want to focus your grid energy on building out the industries that will create the prosperity that will allow people to actually pay for these distributed energy renewable systems that actually make a lot of sense in a place where you don't have a winter.
Right.
And you can really run on some combination of solar and storage all year round for household needs, if you could, maybe in a mini grid to offset across different households. But you don't actually need to build big centralized power plants and reticulate power everywhere. You do need those big power plants for heavy industry.
Yeah. You alluded to geothermal,
Yeah.
but we didn't actually talk about it because most people don't realize how much geothermal energy Kenya has,
Yeah.
and what is below the ground where this stuff can be stored. Can you maybe go in?
So Kenya is a global leader in geothermal, right? When people particularly in climate who think about geothermal, often will think about Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
They've done a great job of becoming a global exporter of energy and energy-related services by developing their geothermal resources really fast, really well. People don't actually realize, yes, Iceland probably has more geothermal energy because they use a lot of it from heating. They're exploiting a lot more a little bit more geothermal energy than Kenya, but Kenya generates more electricity from geothermal than Iceland does, and we are nowhere near our addressable limit. We're a big country. We have the Rift Valley going right through, and that's the El Dorado of geothermal potential. In addition, because of the geological properties of the Rift Valley, the basalts, the ultramafic basalts in the subsurface are ideal for mineralizing carbon dioxide. So if you can capture carbon in some way, shape, or form, if you inject it into certain formations in a place like Kenya, it turns into a solid over a period of a year or two, and that's gone for 10,000 years. That's about as neat a carbon transaction. If you're talking about additionality, it doesn't get neater than that. No more monitoring. Here is the carbonate that used to be the CO2 in the atmosphere. And we've got hundreds of billions of tons of capacity in the Rift Valley between Kenya, Ethiopia, some of the other neighboring countries. Hundreds of billions of gigatons of potential capacity or hundreds of gigatons, let's say, of capacity to store carbon. Arguably, a good chunk of the Industrial Revolution's emissions could end up being stored there. Now, this is not to say, hey, no problem solved. There's a lot of hard things you'd need to do. But what better industry to build in the cradle of mankind than mankind's insurance policy, using energy, using local ingenuity, because we have a lot of young people who work in the geothermal sector, understand these reactions, understand these reservoirs, growing construction sector, and so on. Tap all of that, and the same place that humanity began its journey to becoming the dominant and in some ways most destructive species, begin to actually scale up doing this in the right way, or actually putting back into the ground what we took out as fossil fuels over the last few hundred years.
Well, and just to kind of draw out something you touched on, the argument against direct air capture is that it uses massive amounts of energy. You pointed out the numbers, but you didn't make it as clear as you did when we spoke the other day, which is that argument's essentially gone because Kenya has a surplus of renewable energy. It's not like you're taking it away from the grid and then
we're looking for things to deploy the energy to. Kenya is looking for ways to export the benefit of its renewable energy. Now, ideally, a good chunk of that is in moving some of the world's energy intensive industries to where the world's cleanest energy is, and creating jobs here where we also have a lot of the raw materials that feed those industries and a lot of the workforce that can work in those industries. But one of those industries we do have the raw material for, which is those basalt formations, is carbon removal. And we could be going for a very long time before we can say, well, this marginal unit of energy or geothermal resource could have been or was snatched away from this other good use. We can do it all. And frankly, making Kenya a more investable destination is the biggest thing we can do to unlock that potential. So come one, come all. Green data centers, green hydrogen,
Green steel.
energy intensive green manufacturing, green steel, etc., and direct air carbon and direct air carbon capture. All of them are part of this basket that we're trying to develop in the Great Carbon Valley business.
Yeah, that's exciting. Boy, I could dive into any one of these. It's kind of a blessing to be pressed for time because now I feel I got to keep moving right along. I tend to ramble on these things, but I'm sure I would love to try to come back and dive into
Always
some
happy
of these
to do
individually.
sequels.
Yeah,
Hopefully it's Godfather 2 and not...
yeah, not 3, yeah.
Yeah.
They jumped the shark by that one.
Yeah.
I think because another interesting thing, because there's so much happening right now, Kenya is also in the midst of its it just came out with its new draft carbon market regulation,
Yes.
which creates it's in draft form. It's out for public consultation, but it has some really interesting ideas in there on how they want to, where they want to kind of pull money in, where they want to promote green development in the country. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? And again, if you're not up on it, that's fine too.
I will be careful because I'm not up on the details. What I will talk about is, I think, the thing I will give the Kenyan government a lot of credit for was relatively early key members of the government, including the head of state, understanding the macro argument here, which is that there is this big, currently unpriced externality of adverse climate effects. And we're creating the mechanisms to make it a priced externality, so charging people who emit. And that creates an opportunity for people who do the opposite of emitting. And so how do you design these mechanisms? There is, because of some of the illusions I talked about earlier, we've seen governments immediately go to, well, we must be getting exploited in some way. How do we first make sure that no exploitative transaction can go through? And that's an understandable lens. I think where a lot more folks in the Kenyan government are going is, how do we maximize the chances that we can create an internationally competitive industry that attracts investment, attracts customers, has predictability, and has the makings of scalability. That's the idea. Of course, many challenges between concept and execution. A lot of people need to learn a lot and build a lot of comfort and confidence with how these markets actually work. And there's a lot of pitfalls in there. But I will say that just watching the way that the drafting process has proceeded, you have seen, whether it's in the legislature or in the ministries, a growing level of familiarity with how these markets work and how one might think of country benefit. Do I wish it was happening faster? Absolutely. Is Kenya still doing, I think, a decent job of being a trailblazer in creating some of the circumstances for a market that actually works for Kenyans? I think so. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating.
Yeah. I've heard the proof is in the pudding. I've never heard that one. Yeah, and it's interesting how because you're saying stuff that a lot of people have said, which is they're giving pretty high marks to the way this process evolved. And these are people who are speaking to me off the record and are not shy about saying things are messed up. And I remember when the first regulation came out a few years ago, it was kind of a weird one to me. Even it looked like it was designed for red only. And this new one is really well thought out. They've really done the public consultation has been, from what I've heard from people, very inclusive. And this idea of prioritizing hard to abate sectors so that they can try to subsidize their cement or also green building using wood. And then also carbon capture and storage, prioritizing that. And it looks like they're trying to also create a domestic voluntary market, maybe so that low-cost emission reductions stay in country and can be used by industry.
Towards our NDCs and so on. So I again, you've nailed it. They are trying to get this right. It is complicated stuff. It is made more complicated by the fact that in any political system, there's a lot of mutual mistrust among different factions. Sometimes well earned, and other times it can be counterproductive. And I do think top marks to some of the folks who have been, with great modesty, kind of toiling away in the background, nudging this train back on the tracks and keeping a clear focus on national benefit. Why is it worth Kenya's while to do? And then competitiveness. That's a very tricky bicycle to balance. And I think I'm glad that there are some really well-intentioned and committed technocrats who are helping push this along and bringing their colleagues along. And I'm also glad that the Kenyan entrepreneurial spirit, never misses an opportunity. And the minute people are like, wait, this could be something real, you're starting to see a groundswell of people saying, well, maybe I can innovate this way. Maybe I can innovate that way. And that's what you really wanted to see, is you want the rules to create a space where carbon and climate finance is not something where the projects are done to Africa, which is the worst version of this. Someone comes in and says, well, just sign here, no need to understand it. We extract value, etc. Slightly better is when it's done for Africa. Again, lots of, you guys do your thing, we'll consult you and so on, but actually this is something we will do. Increasingly, there's a sense of, hey, can it be done with local, not just communities, but professionals, investors, and eventually moving to a situation where a good chunk of this market is just entirely serviced by those actors. Because that's when you get to a real pure export industry, is where you've built that comparative and competitive advantage to say, we have some of the best developers of a range of carbon and climate interventions anywhere in the world. You will get the best bang per carbon dollar spent if you spend it in Kenya.
Yeah, and that does seem to be, hopefully that's where we're heading. It's always frustrating to me, we have to reverse the brain drain then, but because it's frustrating living in the States and seeing all these African entrepreneurs, Kenyan, Nigerian. Did you know the most successful immigrant group in the U.S. is Nigerians?
Yep.
Everybody asks, who do you think it is? Oh, it's Indians.
Yep.
It's China. No, it's
Yep.
Nigerians.
Exactly.
But they can't, the same guy who would be pushing a cart in...
But I think that is where we became so excited about climate positive growth. Because part of the reason that happens is individual people optimizing, not just for themselves, but for their families, for their communities at home and so on, are saying there's nothing I can do here that will unlock as much value as what my talent can unlock if I can get to one of these other places. The only way you fix that, ultimately, and it's how India fixed it, is you create big opportunities at home that get your best and brightest. Some of them to stay, and some of them to actually be amazing ambassadors for the country wherever they ended up. Right? One of the most senior engineers at Tesla and then at Rivian, Charlie Mwangi, a friend of mine, is a great example of this. He's now in climate venture capital, doing amazing stuff in the US, has been at the forefront of a lot of these technologies. And yes, he would not have had the chance to build that expertise and work on those cutting edge projects had he never left after graduating from the University of Nairobi. Now that he's out there, yes, you might say, well, what a brain drain. But he is an incredible door opener, an amazing coach, and an incredible connector of that next generation, kind of demystifying that illusion of mastery and being like, this science team I'm looking at here off the Eastern Bypass here in Nairobi is just as good as the one I was diligencing in Utah. And you guys have nothing to be ashamed of. Keep going. So there's something in that every place I've looked at, you export talent and then that talent contributes, but you never get that contribution to work until you find some things you can just be the best in the world at.
Yeah. And, you talked about India. And because I've asked a lot of people, what will it take for Kenya or any African country to really develop its potential as a capital for green steel, green hydrogen? And they've always said they have to play India's game, which is, and that's a challenge because it's a political game. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm literally parroting back to you what people have said to me. But like in India, they kind of designated national champions, and they're going towards green steel because they're able to say, okay, in a way it's anti-democratic capitalism because they're saying we're going to designate you as a national champion. It's kind of like what Europe was like before the wall came down. Is that doable here, and is that really? I guess because I like to think of capitalism as a democratizing influence where you and not saying, okay, you're rich, you can do it. You know what I mean? There's kind of a paradox there that.
Yes, and I think. So firstly, I think it's an oversimplification of the India story, right? Yes, there is a lot of backing of big national champions now. And you'll see the same dynamic in every country that has made the jump to middle income status and beyond. You see it in South Korea, you see it in Japan, you see it in China for sure. Perhaps its most extreme form in China. At some point in the journey, you do need to say, okay, what's our strategy for making sure that we are chasing a few sectors where we can win and not kind of spreading ourselves too thin. I don't think that's where you start. And for decades, the current Indian administration is able to play this kind of game, and whether they do it wisely or unwisely is what determines whether they end up on South Korea's trajectory or Argentina's. The thing I will observe is for years, you had a growing private sector that wasn't, so what established India as a really interesting destination for global capital? It was the rise of the globally competitive knowledge businesses, your Infosys, your Tata consulting services, and lots of global companies going to India for the talent base. Again, in part shaped by the fact that there was a diaspora that knew what they left behind, and that they could look good to their bosses or to their shareholders by doing more in their home country. That part wasn't government strategy, but as you begin to accumulate capital and you get to the initial starting lines, then you can play. And I think Africa's first step is find those spaces where there is competitiveness, because you don't decree the creation of a Reliance Group or a Tata Industries.
Right.
It either exists for you to now back or partner with, or it doesn't. And there's that first step of all these young entrepreneurs and innovators. Hey, let's have that race. And then you will get to a point, and you know what? It happens everywhere. Boeing is an important part of U.S. foreign policy because it's a national champion in a critical sector. And you will see that in other places. But I think the first step is find a space where it's easy to be competitive. Maybe the last thing I'll say, it's kind of inaccurate, but I like it as a simplifying lens of what I'm proposing. There's an argument that says the way that China got to be a major part of the global economy after, its several centuries of being on the sidelines was converting a good chunk of its population into the world's industrial workforce, a cheap, efficient, highly focused industrial workforce. There's an argument that says India's first step into really catching up with China and really taking off itself was creating the world's knowledge workforce. It's not all that India did, but it's a big chunk of what made India increasingly attractive and competitive. I would argue that for Africa, instead of industry or knowledge, it'll be the world's climate workforce that gives us that first step and then unlocks other opportunities.
Yeah. No, the dominoes are lined up. That makes perfect sense. This is, we're actually zipping along in good time here. I think that the fact that I thought I was pressed for time even imposed a little discipline on me. That maybe I should do this more often.
Excellent.
I wanted to just go into what lies ahead for you, but before I do that, is there anything you think we should be focusing on here? Anything that because we kind of zipped along, we touched on so many different points. Anything you want to elaborate on or maybe bring in as something new?
No, I think. Well, kudos, Steve. The questions have been on point, and I've covered a lot of the what I think of as a key ground in terms of what makes this an exciting time to be tackling climate in Africa. And there's always something more we could cover, but maybe we leave that for the sequel.
Okay, yeah. And what's next for you?
So right now, I'm very heavily focused on Africa Climate Ventures, where after now 2.5 years of operation, we've raised a decent amount of capital. It would sound small to global audiences, but actually has been more than sufficient to really get our first few companies on track. We're out there raising additional capital, looking for investors who buy into the Africa and the climate story. And actually saying, look, we are not saying, hey, come in, do a solid for the continent, maybe take slightly lower returns. We're saying if you're willing to be flexible or thoughtful about how you structure your investment and align with this mechanism, we're actually quite confident that we can deliver globally competitive returns in this space. So we are out there actually now pitching to potential investors, hopefully raising another round of a few tens of millions of dollars. And the idea is not to over-raise and be sitting with a whole bunch of capital you have to force feed into an ecosystem that isn't ready for it, but to have enough to be judicious. Because actually, no, you can't afford to make just careless bets, but also to do what is necessary to scale up the businesses that have an opportunity to scale.
That's James Mwangi wrapping up this edition of Bionic Planet, made possible with support from Quantum Commodity Intelligence. These guys are at the forefront of democratizing investment in Africa, and you can find them at qcintel.com. All one word. That's qcintel.com. But their support only goes so far. If you like the show and want more and better episodes, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. There you can support us for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. The exact address is patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. And Bionic Planet is all one word, no dots or dashes. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Until next time, thanks for listening.